In the second hard fall injury of the day, Giannis Antetokounmpo was ruled out quickly from Game 1 after suffering this hard fall early on today against the Heat. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer. Let's keep breaking down these injuries, talking now about Giannis and his lower back contusion suffered on this play. A key determining factor in how significant this is going to be is truly what part of Giannis's lower back or butt region landed on the ground first, in terms of, was this muscle that is primarily bruised and contused and took a lot of the impact, or was this bone? Because either is probably going to be treated in a similar fashion, but one is probably going to also result in more functional limitation. It looks like Giannis pretty much lands square on the lower portion of his back, kind of right at the sacrum that we'll point out in our anatomy video. It's not really landing off to the side purely on one glute versus the other. It doesn't seem like his lower back takes the brunt of the impact. This truly does look like he just lands square on the sacrum. Possibly a little bit more on the right side, as we can see where his hand position is here. But again, we're talking about more glute sacral area as opposed to just the muscles of the low back. With our biodigital anatomy tool here, I'm highlighting the different muscles and bones of this lower back region. And one important thing to differentiate here that separates this from something like what Steph Curry had with a tailbone injury is the anatomy of the coccyx, which is the tailbone, versus just the sacrum and the pelvis. On the broadcast, Reggie Miller said something about landing right on the tailbone, and typically whenever somebody lands flat on their back or butt like Giannis did, that doesn't necessarily injure the coccyx or the tailbone, as opposed to when you land in a seated position like we saw with Steph Curry when he injured his tailbone a number of years ago. So the main muscles that we're going to have padding this area from the fall are going to be the glute maximus. The glute maximus is the major hip extensor muscle that forms the buttock. Deep to the glute maximus, there's two other glute muscles. There's the gluteus medius and the gluteus minimus that sit on the side of the hip. A contusion like this one where Giannis fell, I'm not really worried about injuries or hematoma within the glute medius or minimus. This is really just going to be the glute maximus on the superficial side taking the brunt of the impact. What's important though here is in this mid portion of the low back, there's not really any muscles covering up the sacrum. We have these thin little external muscles that come down from the back, but those aren't big and bulky enough that they're going to prevent a lot of trauma going to the bone in a fall. So if we hide those muscles, what we see exposed beneath it is the sacrum. The sacrum is where basically our spinal column is connected to the pelvis. The SI joints are the joints between the sacrum and the ilium, so the hip bones. But there's really not any muscle or significant skin padding this area of the sacrum whenever somebody lands like Giannis did. If you land more on the side, a little bit rotated to where the glute can take the majority of the impact, then you're probably talking about more of a bleed or a bruise, hematoma formation within the muscle of the gluteus maximus. But if you land squarely on your low back, now you're talking about more of an injury to the sacrum with some bone bruising and microtrauma bleeding within the actual bone of the sacrum. The way that Giannis fell here, I'm much more worried about a contusion of the sacrum as opposed to the glute muscles. One less optimistic thing, if you notice here how Giannis's left hip is flexed upwards, what that's going to do is it's going to pre-tension his glute muscle on the left side and basically make it a little bit more taut to where it can't absorb as much of that load whenever he lands down on the ground. So it's going to even make it more likely for that trauma, for that energy to be directed into his sacrum and cause a contusion of the sacrum. Now, a contusion is a bruise. A contusion is bleeding within the anatomy structure. If it's a contusion or a bruise within a muscle, that's actually tearing, bleeding of the muscle fibers. If it's a contusion in the bone, there's been microtrauma within the bone where the bone itself can bleed within the inner portions. So that's where distinguishing if it's in the bone or the muscle, I think, makes a difference here with the playoffs. A big significant hematoma, a bruise in a muscle, is going to be symptomatic whenever you try and fire that muscle. And so if you have a large bruise, a large blood accumulation within the glute muscle, that's going to be more painfully provocative for trying to fire your glute and do more functional activities. If you have more of a bruise in just the bone, especially a bone like the sacrum, it's going to be more of a continuous pain, but a pain that might necessarily change or get worse whenever you're firing that muscle. Bone bruises generally take longer to heal than muscle bruises, but I don't think of them as being as much of a functional limitation as a muscle bruise. So in this case with Giannis, if this is truly a bruise of the sacrum, meaning the lower portion of the bone of the spinal column meeting into the pelvis, I'd worry about longer term pain, but less impaired function. If this is more of a bruise to the muscles, I'd be worried about less long-term pain, but more impaired function. So it's kind of a trade-off of one for the other. I will say the fact that Giannis was ruled out so quickly in a game where the Bucks were losing at the time is at least concerning enough that his function was so impaired that he wouldn't even hopefully be able to continue in the second half. It's really difficult to pick up true fractures of the sacrum or the pelvis in this area on just a standard x-ray, so I'd expect Giannis is probably going to get some more advanced imaging to make sure there's no fracture in these bones or more significant muscle tearing in that area. Definitely not something I would anticipate Giannis being out for an extended period of time. It's probably going to be sore for a while and might affect his play in that regard, but nothing about this makes me think like playoff-ending injury unless we hear there's a nondescript fracture that wasn't seen on initial tests. That's it for the video, everybody. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below, and until next time, we'll see you later.